Throughout the latter half of the Ruthless Aggression era and into the PG era, WWE's video game of choice was Smackdown vs Raw. A concept that, at the time, made a lot of sense, as it came shortly after the company's roster was split into two for the first time. Running from 2004 until 2010, WWE and video game partners offered a total of 7 games under the Smackdown vs Raw banner. Today we're going to take a look back at the Smackdown vs Raw series. Many fans remember this period fondly, as some beloved features that remain in place in WWE games to this day were created throughout its run. To some, it is considered to be the peak of WWE gaming, and wrestling fans remain hopeful that 2K can deliver something on the same level in the future. As WWE 12 and WWE 13 were still created by Ukes and THQ, just using a new title, the games have been included as they don't fit with the 2K series, and they only have 2 entries in their own series. So there's a note for you. Welcome to Honor Wrestling Club, and in today's video we'll be counting down every Smackdown vs Raw game ranked from worst to best, including WWE 12 and WWE 13. However, before we crack on with the list, I'd just like to take a moment to firstly welcome you to Honor Wrestling Club. It's really exciting to have you here, and I hope you're going to enjoy the ride we're going to take you on today. If you are new here, be sure to click that subscribe button and the notification bell to make sure you never miss out on any of the fun content we produce here at Honor Wrestling Club. And why not give this video a big thumbs up to let me know that you've enjoyed this. Welcome to the club. Now, without further ado, let's jump straight into the list with WWE 12 that dropped the Smackdown vs Raw name, and that's coming in at number 9. WWE 12 dropped the Smackdown vs Raw title as the brand split was no longer featured on WWE programming, and members of both rosters just competed wherever they wanted. The gameplay did have some changes, such as improvements being made to the AI so that they didn't use the same moves over and over and over and over and over again. Plus, there was some tweaking on the grapple system. Otherwise, it was quite similar to Smackdown vs Raw 2011. Road to WrestleMania was also taken in a new direction, as players couldn't just start by choosing who they wanted to play as and take them into WrestleMania. Instead, it was split into 3 acts, with Sheamus, Triple H, and a custom-created wrestler named Jacob Cass. The most praised change has to be what was done to the Universe mode, as it now truly felt like something the players could control and customise to their likings, whilst also featuring enough randomness mixed in. In number 8, with Smackdown vs Raw 2008, there was a rough change for fans. Smackdown vs Raw 2008 is most of the time rated as one of the worst games alongside Smackdown vs Raw 2009. This was the entry, after all, that introduced the concept of fighting styles, which gave a primary and a host of secondary abilities to wrestlers who had those styles. For example, a showman could steal an opponent's taunt to drain all their foes' momentum, and a brawler can make all their strikes stronger and unblockable for a period of time. The gameplay in 2008 was strong, and the game's 24/7 mode had some good ideas, but suffered from half-baked execution. The soundtrack was killer as well, and you could use songs from artists such as Chevelle as the entrance themes for your creator wrestler. This was also the first WWE game to include the ECW brand, so many legends of the brand such as Taz, Tommy Dreamer and the Sandman made their returns to the series, or debuts for some. Smackdown vs Raw 2008 was the third and final time that General Manager mode would be included in the series, now featuring a third brand in Extreme Championship Wrestling. The mode was highly regarded, but would be removed with the next entry and wouldn't be brought back until WWE 2K22. In at number 7, we have WWE 13 that revived the Attitude Era. THQ's final WWE title before facing bankruptcy and Take-Two Interactive acquiring the publishing rights to the future WWE series. WWE 13 introduced a mode that has now become a staple of 2K's series, the Showcase mode. Under the name Attitude Era mode, players got to relive and play through some of the biggest moments of the Attitude Era and the Monday Night Wars between the WWE and WCW. The roster also focused on this change, as current names and prior versions of wrestlers such as The Rock, Edge and Christian, The Undertaker and more were included. Besides the Attitude Era mode, there wasn't much that was changed between WWE 12 and WWE 13, besides some minor tweaks and some improvements in animations. Universe mode saw some changes in the stories that could play out, as Paul Heyman took a role in the creation of the mode and helped Ukes and THQ improve things a bit more. Ukes would continue developing the WWE series of games, but now under the 2K umbrella after WWE 13's release, before Ukes themselves left and started a relationship with All Elite Wrestling. In at number 6 we have Smackdown vs Raw 2009, which did not stand out enough. There was nothing inherently wrong with Smackdown vs Raw 2009, but this and Smackdown vs Raw 08 were interchangeable at the bottom. This one suffers from being just a bit too forgettable. The roster was decent enough and the gameplay was perfectly fine, but matches sometimes felt like they went on forever. The promotional material for the entry heavily showed off their new tag team system that in action didn't feel much different from previous titles. Former DX members Triple H and Shawn Michaels adorned the cover, a stark reminder that the company failed to create any new stars that year. This wasn't a terrible game by any means, just not in the conversation for all-time greats. On the plus side, it was the first in the series to include the much-loved Road to WrestleMania mode, a replacement for the typical season mode. Another positive aspect of the game was how the series put a renewed focus on tag team wrestling. Features that WWE games are used to now, like double tag team finishes and hot tags, were introduced in this title. The Road to WrestleMania mode featured names such as CM Punk, John Cena, Chris Jericho, Triple H and The Undertaker. Those are like the 5 biggest stars in the company at the time. Where players went through a scripted storyline culminating in a huge WrestleMania match. In at number 5 we have the original Smackdown vs Raw, which innovated the franchise. The main reason that 2005 ranks so low on this list is simply because it was the first. The graphics weren't the strongest and the series was just establishing its identity. Honestly, the gameplay wasn't half bad, as it began to shift the series away from arcade gameplay into more of a simulation. The core of the gameplay was still heavily inspired by the previous title, Here Comes the Pain, regularly regarded as one of the best wrestling games. You can check out what we here at On a Wrestling Club think are the 10 greatest wrestling games of all time in a previous video on the channel. The roster was decent enough in this title, with names such as Eddie Guerrero and even Sable rounding it out. One much loved feature was the season mode that had full voice acting for every playable character, which led to insane cutscenes between superstars who didn't get the chance to interact on television. The soundtrack for this game was also one of the best in the franchise. This was the first WWE game to include mini-games at the start of matches, such as a test of strength, or the first to throw a strike before the bell rings. Another interesting gameplay feature was you could select if you wanted your wrestler to be a heel or a babyface for a given match. Babyfaces would be rewarded for doing things such as high-flying moves and following the rules, whereas a heel would be rewarded for disobeying the referee's rules, using weapons, and generally just being a jerk to the fans. In at number 4, we have Smackdown vs Raw 2010, which seemed like a fairly safe upgrade. 2010 was something of a groundbreaking year for the Smackdown vs Raw franchise. Many of the modes were just updated or refined rather than overhauled. This included the Road to WrestleMania feature, which was updated with new stories for a few roster members such as Edge, Shawn Michaels and Mickie James. It was also notable for including a 2-player story where you and a friend could control Triple H and John Cena. Another decently big mode that was introduced was the Story Designer, which gave players the chance to create full feuds and promos. This would serve as the basis for the beloved Universe mode, which is still a staple in WWE video games to this day. The roster was actually a little light on this one, and was padded with odd characters such as the red and green dummies that are seen in the Create a Moveset mode. Not exactly something gamers were asking for at the time, but we'll take it. This was the first in the series to get a mobile launch as well. However, the iOS version sits at a lowly 42 on Metacritic, whereas the general score on 360 on Metacritic is 80. In number 3, we have Smackdown vs Raw 2011, which created some unique mechanics. Smackdown vs Raw 2011 ranks highly on this list, mainly because of the introduction of the Universe mode. an open sandbox mode where players controlled WWE and created their own shows and pay-per-view events. SmackDown vs Raw 2011 was the first to introduce a much revamped gameplay style compared to years prior, something that had a massive change in the way weapons were used and destroyed. The Road to WrestleMania mode was still the main story mode and was also updated to feature the ability to walk around backstage and speak to fellow superstars, leading to some secret Easter eggs in the mode. And this year cranked up the ridiculousness, with moments such as playing as an amnesiac heel Rey Mysterio and speaking to the ghost of Paul Bearer. The roster didn't reach the heights that the 2K series had been offering just yet, but it did decide to feature some legends and talents not employed by the WWE, such as Rob Van Dam and Ricky Steamboat. 2011 also marked the final time that ECW was featured as a third brand in the series, and this would be the final installment in the series, as the game released the following year was simply called WWE 12. And at number 2 we have SmackDown vs Raw 2007, which was an amazing follow-up. SmackDown vs Raw 2007 boasts the deepest roster up to that point in the franchise, with 67 playable characters. The gameplay was solid enough as well, albeit with updated controls that were a little different from the 2 previous games. This was the game that made the right thumbstick a crucial part of gameplay, as all your grapples were mapped to that stick. After a few adjustments, it was easy to navigate this new version of the game. After being introduced in SmackDown vs Raw 2006, which we'll get to in a moment, don't worry, GM mode was massively upgraded, and is a big reason fans still go back and play SmackDown vs Raw 2007 today. This was also the first game that allowed players to brawl in the crowd. WWE Smackdown Just Bring It technically had it, but it was pointless. And with names such as Umaga and Mr. Perfect, this title will always be highly cherished by wrestling game fans. This was the first WWE game released on the 360, however the planned PS3 version was cancelled. And at number 1, we have the peak of the series, with SmackDown vs Raw 2006. Ask most wrestling fans what their favourite SmackDown vs Raw game was, and they will most likely point to 2006. Whether it was the fast-paced gameplay or considerable roster depth, SmackDown vs Raw 2006 holds a special place in the heart of fans. Graphics-wise, this was the most impressive wrestling game to date. With new features such as the season mode, you could take a large percentage of the game's roster through various storylines across the Raw and SmackDown brands. This game introduced a stamina system as well, which brought the game into a simulation-based system, making it more strategic than previous entries. However, this could be turned off for fans of that more arcadey style that people were used to. SmackDown vs Raw 2006 is the preferred choice amongst all other entries in the series. It was just that damn good. Plus, it was the very first game to introduce the GM mode, a mode that allowed players to control the general manager of either Raw or SmackDown and compete to make the best weekly wrestling show out there. The mode was so beloved that it made a return in the WWE 2K series over 15 years later. And there you have it, there's our list. So what do you think of the SmackDown vs Raw series, and which one do you think is the best? Be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you haven't already, be sure to give this video a thumbs up. And as I've said, if you haven't already, be sure to give the channel a subscribe and click the notification bell to make sure you never miss out on any of the fun content we produce here at Honor Wrestling Club. However, until next time, I'd just like to thank you for watching and welcome to the club. See ya!